Hi, welcome to the sew along for the Belmore jacket. I hope you enjoy sewing this with me. I'm going to do a full sew along and guide you through all the steps. So I have my pieces cut out here, as you can see. I've decided to use this kind of bone colored linen here. Just be sure that you've marked in all of the notches where they are, and also the drill holes. So you can see here, hopefully, that I just mark my drill holes using an awl, and I just stab it through the pattern piece and make a little temporary hole. Now, it's not a real hole because it hasn't broken any of the fibers. So it will actually just heal itself over time. So I find it's the most useful way of doing things. I'm also going to Hong Kong bind all of my seams. So I have some binding that I made. This is 1.5 inches wide. I'll trim back any excess, and I haven't even folded it up. I've just cut it, and I like to have it sewn together in one continuous length. I find that's the best thing for me. And then I have some fine twill tape. This is 1.5 inches wide. Sorry, 1/4 inch wide. If it were 1/2 inch wide, it wouldn't really matter because it's going to be on the back, but it would just I think that this narrow stuff is what I have on hand. I find it a very useful notion. So I have a full roll of it. The other thing that I've gone ahead and done, I'm just going to move this out of the way, is I have stay stitched the back neckline just around this curve on both sides separately, and also the front neckline. So just about 8 millimeters from the edge. So it's a little over 1/4 inch away from the edge. It'll be hidden within the seam allowance once we attach the collar, but it's there because this is a curve and we don't want it to stretch out of shape. Just be careful when you are stay stitching that you're not actually stretching it as you're stay stitching. So it's there to just protect this curve, and we want to just try and preserve that. And I have also fused my fusible interfacing to the back, the wrong side of the collar pieces. You can see it's a little bit smaller than the collar piece, and I've tried to center it. To be honest, it's not the biggest deal if it's not totally centered. You can see I'm a bit off here, but that's because this linen is super duper shifty, and basically what was happening is as I was cutting it, it was shifting around and moving. So what I did is after I fused it, I actually laid my pattern piece back on top of the linen now that it was all stable and fused, and I just trimmed it off just to make sure that it was conforming to the pattern piece. This is especially important at this end here, this curved end. You want to make sure that conforms exactly to the pattern piece. So you're actually better off losing a bit of length in your collar, a centimeter or 1/4 inch or so if you need to from the lower end, and making sure that these curves are really accurate. So just ensure that that is the case. Okie dokie. So the first thing I'm going to do is locate my lower front panel. That is not yet. Here it is. Okay. So here's my lower front panel. It's a funny shape. And that's because the pocket bag will flip down like this and, become the pocket. Just to orient you, oops. The side seam is where that notch is, about halfway up. And yeah, so the center front there's another notch about 1.5 inches from this lower edge here. So oops, I'm dropping things over here. The first thing we're going to do here is, and I realize that this is a little bit out of step with the instructions, but it doesn't really matter, is I'm going to take my twill tape, and I'm going to, I guess what it is I like to get everything kind of prepped and ready to go. I'm going to cut a piece of twill tape, about the length between the two drill holes. Doesn't have to be precise or anything, just something like that. I'm going to cut 2 of them. one for each side. So I'm going to lay this twill tape down, and you can use just regular cotton tape, it doesn't have to be a twill. So where the one edge of it is right on those drill holes. So the drill hole is right here, and that's the twill tape. It's on the pocket bag side. So I'm going to sew that down. I'm going to sew extremely close to this edge, and I'm going to sew exactly between these drill holes. So the twill tape will be, I guess it will overlap those drill holes just very slightly. Just going to run a line of stitching there, and I'm going to do that on the wrong side of my garment on both the left and the right hand sides. So I'll do that and then I'll be back. Okie dokie, so I've sewn that twill tape on as neatly as I can, and what that does is that gives you it stabilizes the pocket edge so it's not going to bag out, and it also gives you, you know, a row of stitching that you're going to end up pressing along, and it will keep the pocket nice and stable for you. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to pay our attentions to the back now. So here is my back piece. This is the lower back piece. You can see there's a double notch here and there's a single notch here. So the single notch is the side seam and the double notch is going to attach to the upper back, if I can find that. This looks like it. Okay, so here's that upper back. Oops, there we go. So the side seam is the single notch, remember, and there should be a corresponding double notch on the back. So this fabric actually doesn't have a right and a wrong side, which is just the way it is. I'm going to place my pieces right sides together for the lower back and upper back. And the same on the other side. At this point, you just want to make sure that you have a mirror image here. So we're making a left and a right back all together. We're going to match the double notches here. And sew this seam and that seam across with a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to Hong Kong bind that seam. I'll show you how I do that. Or if you are not Hong Kong binding, you can just finish it by serging or overlocking or zigzagging or whatever method you prefer. Okay, so I've sewn this seam and you can see I'm at my sewing machine now. I want to show you how to Hong Kong bind it. So the important thing when you're Hong Kong binding is there will be a right and a wrong side. And you want to always make sure that the right side is how you're working. So, you know, flipping this back piece up, that's the neckline, the center back's here. I'm going to be pressing this down. So I'm always going to be working from this side, which is going to be the right side. So I'm just going to, this is the center back, I'm just flipping it 90 degrees. So when we're Hong Kong binding, we're going to sew the binding on right sides together, and it actually really doesn't matter how wide it is as long as it's not too narrow. We're going to just sew it on just with a 1/4 inch right sides together. So this is that upper back piece. I'm lining up these raw edges. I'm just going to sew it on the 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm just making sure everything's matching up nicely. Right sides together. I'm just letting that excess binding just fall off the edge. It's not a problem. So I'm going to be careful not to stretch that binding. I'm just letting it sit on top. You can pin it if you like. Just kind of lining it up as I go. You can pin it, of course. just going to trim off that excess binding. Okay, now I'm going to go to my iron and I'm going to press this down. So that's the first thing I'm going to do is press it down. Okay, so I pressed it down over the top and then I'm going to just wrap it around those raw edges. So I'm enclosing them. On the wrong side, you'll see there's quite a bit of overlap and I've got a raw edge here. So I'm not folding this under, I'm just keeping that open. And that's what makes this a Hong Kong bind and not a true bias bind. We use bias strips, but it's just called a Hong Kong bind, and the other way is called a bias bind. So what I like to do, I actually don't press it over here. I actually prefer to just do it with my fingers, unless what I'm binding is, like if this were a very floppy fabric, then I might decide to fold it over, like press it over before I sewed it, but I actually prefer not to. I just use that edge as a guide. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stitch in the ditch. Now, if you don't like stitching in the ditch, you can certainly edge stitch here if it's a little bit messy. It also doesn't really matter at this point. I mean, honestly, the Hong Kong bind is so attractive that it doesn't, if there are a few like little deviations in your sewing, it's not going to matter. So I'm just going to stitch in the ditch along the seam. I'm just using my thumb to just roll that under evenly. Okay, so there we go. That's done. You can see I actually, a little bit here, I caught a little bit of the binding, but I'm not going to worry about that because it's just still doing its job. I'm going to flip it to the wrong side. You can see that there's quite a lot of excess here. So I'm just going to go back and trim it. You can start off with a narrower piece of bias, but I just find it's actually easier to handle if you have plenty of overlap on the wrong side, and it's easy enough to just trim back. That's what it looks like from the right side, and when I open it out and I will press it down, it will look like that. And so that's a really lovely seam finish. I'm not going to demonstrate the Hong Kong bind on every seam. So this is the last time I'll demonstrate the Hong Kong bind, but basically you'll finish every seam and I'll let you know if you'll be binding them separately or together. So I'll be back with the next step. Okay, and there's that finished Hong Kong bind. So what I'm going to do now is sew that center back seam. So I'm just going to go right side up on this piece and right sides together with this piece. At this point, you'll get a good check to make sure that you haven't accidentally made two lefts or two rights. If your fabric's like mine and it doesn't really have a right and a wrong side. Okay, so what I'm going to be really careful to do is match these seams here. So what I like to do is I like to match them by eye, and then I put a pin in exactly through the stitches on one side, right on that stitching line. So right, 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch in from the edge. Poke it through and make sure it's coming up on the other stitching line. And then that'll make sure that I'm matching. I'm going to sew this center back seam with 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to Hong Kong bind it to one side. It doesn't really matter which side, and press it to one side. I actually just wanted to show you something. I'm halfway through Hong Kong binding this center back seam, and I just wanted to show you that I've clipped this corner of the horizontal seam. There's just so that when I flip it over, there's not a whole lot of bulk there. So I've clipped this back here just to the stitching line, and I've also clipped the other one back just a tiny bit, so kind of like grading it. So I just wanted to show you that so you get a nice finish. I'm gonna finish Hong Kong binding this and then be back for the next step. Okay, so I have my upper fronts here. This is the right side, and then I'm going to try and retrieve my lower fronts. Here we go. So I'm going to place the lower fronts right side together with the upper front. So because it's right side together, where we sewed the twill tape on before is going to be here. Just make sure that you've got that side seam, the side seams matching here. So it's got the notch on the lower front, and of course this is the side seam with the armhole. I find it easiest at this point to flip it over because we need to see these drill holes. So I'm just maneuvering it around, and I'm just going to pop a couple of pins in just to hold it in place while I explain. So I'm just going to pin, this seam together. And then these curves for the pocket bags should match exactly. So this is curved around here to make it easier to bind or finish, but we're not actually going to sew it curved except for this part of the pocket bag. Most important thing here, once I've pinned at this point, is to just make sure this pocket bag is nice and smooth. You know, there's always going to be a tiny bit of discrepancy with your cutting, but we just want it to lay nice and flat. There we go. Okay, so we're going to sew this seam, and we're going to sew it in quite a specific way. So we're not going to, as I said, sew this part in a curve. We're going to go with a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance straight from here to the drill hole. At the drill hole, we'll pivot sharply, like a sharp corner, and then sew around here, curve around the bottom of the pocket bag, both curves, and then up to that other drill hole, pivot sharply as a corner, and then straight across to the side seam here. So it's actually going to be almost a square, but these parts of the pocket bag will be curved. Okay, so you're going to do that, sew that, and then bind that. Just one more thing, just make sure that your drill holes on the front, on the upper front and the lower front match up, just so that it's going to line up with the twill tape that we sewed on. And that when you Hong Kong bind it, if you are, that the right side is for the upper front, because we're going to press these pockets down. Okay, so I've Hong Kong bound this. I actually did it a little bit wider the first pass, close to 1 centimeter, just because I wanted to see a bit more of it on the front here. And then what we'll do is we'll press it down. But I wanted to show you this because it's very exciting. I'm just going to flip it here. So this is the top piece, and when we flip this pocket bag down, okay, so we've got the pocket bag flipped down, and we pop the top up here, then we have our pocket bag down here and our hidden pocket right here. So I don't know, I think that's really cool. So you'll press this seam really neatly along here, and then you'll press it right along that line where the stitching is, and I'll just finger press it, actually, you'll be able to see, and you'll have this really nice kind of hidden pocket here. Okay, so we'll do that on both sides, and then the next step is going to be to bind the shoulder seams separately. So I'm just going to bind the shoulders on the front and on the back without it being sewn together, because we're going to press them open after we have sewn them. So Hong Kong bind them. I'm going to just use a narrow one this time, so just like the 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters for the first pass, or finish them if you prefer, on the front and the back, making sure that the right side of the Hong Kong binding is the right side of the garment. Okie dokie, so I have bound those shoulder seams, or you finish them if that's your preference, and now I'm going to sew the shoulder seams. So I'm just going to go right sides together with the fronts and the backs, and I'm just going to sew those with a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. There we go. Okay, so we're going to sew those shoulder seams and then press them open. Okay, so I've sewn the shoulder seams, pressed them open, and now I have the sleeve. So this is the right side of the jacket, and this is the sleeve. There's a double notch on the back of the armhole, and there's a double notch on the back of the sleeve. So I'm just going to pin it into place. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to match this single notch on the sleeve to that shoulder seam. And then I'm going to match the double notches, and then the side seam. So there might be some ease, that's not a problem. So, or like this is matching opposite curves, so you just make sure you distribute that evenly. There shouldn't be too much ease. And then the same on the front, I'm just going to match that side seam. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sew this sleeve to the garment using a 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and then I'm going to bind it so the seam will be pressed out towards the sleeve. Okay, so the sleeves are on, and I have bound that seam and pressed it towards the sleeve. And then what I also did is I Hong Kong bound the side and sleeve seams in one go. So this is the side seam here into the sleeve. And so there's like 4 passes of that. So, and then this is the other side of that sleeve and the underarm. So I'm going to fold the sleeves in half so it kind of looks like a jacket. Hold on. Going right sides together. Looking so cool. Okay, so I'm going to sew the sleeve seam, like the underarm seam and the side seam, in one go. So from the wrist right down to the hem on both of the sides, and I'm going to use a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And when I do that, I'm just going to be careful to match this. This is the most important thing to match, is actually this seam, horizontal seam here, because you'll see that. Then I'm gonna match the underarm as well. Okay, same on the other side. So I'm going to sew that and press that seam open. Okay, so now what we're going to do is sew the curved parts of the collar together. So what this curving does is it actually gives us a bit of collar shaping, but when we sew it, it's pretty important that we sew this accurately. So I'm right sides together. And I'm going to sew them together using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. It's really important that this part here, this center part here, is perpendicular to the edges, and the same with these end bits here. So make sure you're perpendicular to the cut edge here, then you go around the curve, then perpendicular again, and then the same there. If you like, you can take a straight edge, this is a piece of a pattern piece, and mark that in with chalk if you like. Okay, so I'm going to sew that and clip this curve all the way around and press it open. Okay, so I sewed that and I pressed it open. Now we're going to pay our attention to the bottom end here. I think I did mention in the last step that that was a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Anyway, if you did a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, it won't matter that much. All it'll mean is that your hem will be a little bit deeper. Okay, so now at this other end, we're going to sew this right sides together. So I'm folding it in half, right sides together, and I'm just going to sew straight across here with a 1 centimeter seam allowance on both ends. And then what I'm going to do, I'll come back and I'll show you, I'll turn it through. Okay, so I've sewn that with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my scissors and I'm just going to grade away one layer of that, and then clip off this end here at an angle, and then turn it through like this. Same on the other side. If I can, I'm going to try and grade the same side. But if you don't, it's not really that important. Oops. Okay, so now you are going to press this in half very neatly. Now, when you get to the center back here, make sure you match those seams and make sure that it's nice and smooth through here. If you have a V, what that means is it means that you haven't sewn this center part of the seam straight. So you could go back and try and fix that up a little bit because we don't want it to be a V shape. We want it to be a straight line here. So go and press it in half. Okay, so I've pressed that in half and now we have something that's looking like a collar. So now what you're going to do is top stitch it. So I think it looks nice if the first row of top stitching is, so each row is going to be 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch apart. So, you know, 5/8 from the edge, then another 5/8, then another 5/8. So there's going to be 3 lines of top stitching in all. So go ahead and top stitch that. Okay, so I've top stitched that. Looks pretty good, I think. So now what I recommend you do is you just kind of inspect it, and just in case there is a slight difference between your top stitching on the right and the wrong side, I mean, both the sides should be identical, but you know, it's not, we know it's not always like that. Determine if there is a right side. So I'm going to take my jacket now, and I'm going to find that center back seam, and I'm going to place it with right sides together with the matching that center back seam of the collar to the seam of the jacket. Actually, I'm going to pin it this way. And just check, and that matches up well, so that's good. And then I'm going to pin all the way along. I'm going to start at the center back. I'm just pinning those 3 raw edges together. So the folded edge of the collar is currently facing towards the body. So we've got these 3 raw edges. I'm just matching them up. So 2 of the raw edges are the collar, and one of them is the jacket itself, the neckline of the jacket. So just go and pin it all the way down. What should happen is your collar should end up at this notch down here. Now, mine doesn't quite, because I think what's happened is this linen has stretched out an awful lot. So I can either choose to ease it in a little bit, which I'll probably do, or I can just make a bigger hem. You can't make the hem too big, because what will happen then is it will overlap with where the pocket needs to sit. So yeah, so despite my stay stitching, I've still got a little bit of easing, but that's fine. Great. So that's all eased in. Okay, and then I'll do the same thing on the other side. Let's start at the center back first. Now that I know that there's an easing issue, I'm going to match this to the notch down the bottom first. And then kind of ease it back. I think with experience, you kind of learn how much different fabrics can handle the amount of ease. So when I'm easing this inner edge, I'm basically relying on the characteristics of the weave of the fabric to absorb. See how there's just a little bit more slack on that side, and I know that, you know, I've worked with linen a lot, and so I know how much ease it can kind of withstand. On a curve, it can withstand a bit more. So it's just kind of a feeling you learn over time. Something like a cotton drill or twill, you'll really barely be able to ease it at all, but you wouldn't have it stretching this much. So, you know, with it stretching out comes the ability to ease it. So it's kind of a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. Okay, so I'm going to sew this collar onto the jacket with a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to Hong Kong bind that whole seam. Eventually it will be flipped towards the body, so the seam will sit towards the body, so you'll make sure that the right side of the Hong Kong binding will be on the collar side. And I will also Hong Kong bind the hem all the way around. Oh, even if you are finishing the rest of the seams with, you know, your serger or overlocker, I think it really is important to bind this collar. This is the only place it's really specified. And, you know, I think also the hem, it looks really good too, but it's up to you. If you can't bear to do that, then of course, go ahead and just finish it normally. I just wanted to add one more thing before I bind this seam. I'm actually going to trim away some of this middle layer. So just grade it back a bit. You can't grade the other layers too much, like at all really, because you need the edges to line up to bind them. But I just wanted to show you that you will just trim out some of this middle layer, which is a bit hard to do on camera. And then I'm just going to clip away this extra bulk there. So Hong Kong bind this, so you can see that just makes it a little bit thinner there, but the two edges are still going to line up. Okay, so I have Hong Kong bound around the collar and around the hem, and I'm just going to trim back any excess here before I do the next step. Now, so this collar is going to flip forward like this, okay? And then on the wrong side, you'll see that. Now, it's not very nice to just fold this over and up like that to hem. I mean, you can do that, but what we actually want to do is to stitch this together in here. So that's achieved. So I'm just showing you kind of how it works there, but that's achieved by folding this hem up and then stitching down here along the same stitching line that we sewed the collar on. Now, the important thing here is that if you do it too loose, like if I just loosely fold it up and then turn it through, there's going to be this like extra bit hanging down, you know, like that. So what you actually have to do is when you turn up this hem just to sew this little bit, you have to actually turn it up a little bit too much. So you have to do it super duper tight, even to the point where it's rolling up just the slightest bit. Okay, so see how that's just rolling just the slightest bit, and that's going to ensure that it's going to be as flush as possible. And then I'm going to do that on the other side too. Okay, so folding it up more than I need to, further, just a bit beyond. Okay, so I'm going to sew just this short section, and then I'll be back. Okie dokie. So I've sewn that little bit, and then what you're going to do is just, before you clip anything, you're just going to check it. So I'm just going to pull it through, and you can see how that's actually sitting really flush in line. So that's perfect. If it were stepping down, you just unpick that bit and do it again. So now I'm just going to go ahead and grade this back. So just clip some of this bulk away. And then I'm gonna just, let's see, yeah, it's pretty bulky. Just making sure I'm not clipping through the stitching line. Just clipping off that. Just to make this nice and flat there. I'm going to do that on the other side. Just checking first. It's a good one. Grading this away. And then clipping that corner off and pulling it through. Perfect. Okay. So, there's a little bit of a pucker there, but it's not at the end of the world. What really matters is it's on the outside. So the next thing to do is to give it a good press. So you're going to press that collar, flip it over. So we sewed it like this. We're going to flip it over, you know, press it nicely there, and then press the hem up. So what you'll do is you'll measure this distance and press that up all the way around. It should be about 1.5 inches, which I think is 3.8 centimeters. but if it's slightly different for you, just use this as your guide and press that up all the way around. The next thing to do is to Hong Kong bind your sleeve facings. Now, we highly recommend you do this with a Hong Kong bind, just so that when you turn your cuffs up, if you happen to see the binding, it'll see binding and not, like a finished edge, but it's up to you. Okay, so bind that edge. This is the long edge, so there's a curved kind of upper curve. And then what you'll do is you'll fold it right sides together and just sew a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance down there and press that open. I've actually already done that. If I can find my piece, there it is. So I've already done that. And this is the right side. What you'll do then is you'll just put it inside the sleeve. So right sides together, inside the sleeve opening, and you're going to match that seam here. And then pin it all the way around. It should match exactly. And then sew that on to the sleeve with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. And then you'll grade and clip that and press the seams towards the facing and understitch it. I'll show you that. Okie dokie, so I have pressed up this hem. Now the instructions tell you to stitch it in the ditch. You can do that, or you can edge stitch it, it doesn't really matter. But you'll do it with a longer stitch length because it will show from the other side. Just make sure you start and stop right on this seam line, but sew it from the inside so you can see. I've also sewn the facings onto the sleeves. Here we go. Oops. And you can see that I have understitched them. So all the seam allowances are understitched towards the sleeve. And then I'm going to fold the facings up into the sleeve. Oops, having a bit of trouble doing that. Here we go. And that understitching will help it sit really nicely. And then what you'll do is you'll top stitch it down either in the ditch or actually probably closer to the edge is fine too. So you'll see that this row of stitching around here on the outside. Do it from the inside on a free arm machine, and then your Belmore jacket is done. So anyway, I hope that this sew along was helpful.